Hey everybody, Bucho here, welcoming you to another episode of Storytime with me. Today, we're continuing my exploration of some of the darker stuff in my collections that have been published, and the collection that has yet to be published titled Under a Black Rainbow. Mostly for horror aspects, trying to hype up October, trying to give you guys something fun to listen to in the meantime. Something you may not have heard, or, if you're already a fan of my stuff, thank you. But this will be something new for you to listen to that you've not yet had the chance to read. So, the piece today is called Lambs, and it is 100% influenced by Stephen King, very heavily, even though, if you believe it or not, I am not much for Stephen King's horror. Not that I'm not a fan of it, I just haven't read a whole lot of it. It's actually been a long time since I've read any of his horror stuff. Love his Dark Tower series, but his horror stuff is something that I didn't really dive into too much when I first started reading his stuff. This one's pretty dark. It's long. I am ridiculously happy with how it came out. I didn't know where it was going when I first started it, and I'm really, really happy with the final product. So it's about 24 pages long, about 8,000 words. So I hope you enjoy. A pregnant frog was the first sacrifice the boy submitted to the darkness that had taken up refuge in the abandoned building. He had wandered in from the blinding noonlight, his shoes and socks still wet from playing in the creek. The deeper he walked into the firmament, the more his wet footprints disappeared, leaving smaller partials along the way. It had been the end of summer, the beginning of autumn. He remembered the rattling sound of the cicadas filling his ears and the smell of honeysuckle heavy on the air, each breath ending up sweeter than the last and equally as stifling. But he'd caught the frog and, without thinking, carried it inside the building nearby, whose windows had been broken out, whose walls had been tagged by burgeoning street artists, whose doors had been knocked askew and never locked back up. Something had called out to him while he chased the frog through the creek bed. Something had reached out and slithered into him. It had touched his own little growing pebble of darkness and helped it to expand. The frog's body shrunk and expanded within his two hands, croaking. Its front and hind quarters scrambled against his grip, limp and useless appendages compared to his. It was the first moment in his life that he understood the concept of control, even though he was unable to put that feeling into words. He walked through the dust and the dirt that had accumulated on the cement floor of the building. Inner walls had been torn down, steel beams had been left to stand and rust as time marched ever onward. More graffiti decorated the innermost walls, and since there was no electricity, the light of day illuminated less the deeper he went into the building. He couldn't say why he decided to go into the building, only that a little voice had spoken up inside him, had soothed his loud thoughts and beckoned him toward the comfort of the dark. He'd always seen the building, played out in the fields surrounding it because they were close to home, and the building always held an interesting sway over him. It seemed weird to have a structure like that just out in an open field close to a neighborhood, but what did he know? Nothing. And though this was the first time he'd bothered to explore the building, and though the daylight became less effective the deeper he explored, he seemed to know exactly where to go. Pentagrams and gang signs and names were scrawled along the walls now, marking up nearly every inch of wall space. Candles burned down into puddles lined the crumbling hallways, tattered clothing too. Faded Polaroids had been glued to the walls, the faces of naked women prominent in all of them. He would forget later, but their faces would all have the same lifeless expression, eyes wide open, unseeing, and their mouths frozen in the brief moment before pure terror took hold. Down the halls he walked until a large stairwell appeared in the middle of the building, and went down, the darkness swallowing all but the first 3 steps. Had he been any other child, the black below would have scared him off, and rightfully so, but he was not any other child. The deeper into the building he walked, the calmer he became, as if he were becoming a part of the darkness that boiled and bubbled below the surface. He began his descent, his mind and body fearless as he allowed the darkness to swallow him whole. Each step he took was more sure of itself than the previous one, more confident. The air thickened, seemed to inhale him and pull him deeper into whatever room or hallway existed at the bottom of the stairs. And then he stopped. He couldn't tell if he'd chosen to stop or if he had been forced to stop. From the dark, a deep and breathy sigh of satisfaction, and then the frog was ripped from his hands. The sound of chewing, the spitting of tiny bones out on the floor, the smell of putrefaction in the air. The boy stood in the dark, calmly, waiting. More, the darkness seemed to whisper inside his head. They say sunshine makes for the best disinfectant. And that's probably true, but it kills the monsters hidden away in the cracks and the crevices of the surrounding flora before they're ever confronted. Some would rather get lost in the dark, no moonlight, no starlight, only shadows. The sunshine might allow one to see everything around more clearly, but stumbling around in the dark can be a reminder of the other things someone is made of. Their fears, their nightmares, their regrets, their mistakes. The blackness of night allows one to see themselves more clearly by putting a mirror in front of their face and saying, "Here is also who you are," and that should never be forgotten. So when he walked back out from the darkness of the building into the blinding sunshine, he understood that things would forever be different from that moment forward. He had come face to face with himself, saw what he truly was, even though he would never be able to put that feeling into words. He emerged from the building into the too bright day. The surrounding field was more vivid than he remembered, its colors too much. An acrid taste filled his mouth, and he spat. A blackish loogie smacked loudly onto the cement floor, and he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, streaking it with the same blackish substance. He stared at his hand for a moment and then shrugged. He hiked back down to the creek where he washed his face and his hands before heading home for the night. Thunderstorms arrived that evening and stayed for nearly a week, preventing him from returning to the field to play. Rather than ruin his mood or his playtime, the darkened skies set him at ease. At night, the rain pelted the roof above his upstairs bedroom and the window overlooking the street out front. If, while laying in bed at night, he squinted and stared, the rivulet slipping down the window appeared as a sticky black ichor, which made him think of the whole home being drowned in the stuff. It would fall and coat the home's exterior like tar, building up at the foundation and then covering the windows and the siding and the porch and, finally, the roof. Slowly the home would become a pitch-black edifice in a world of thunder and rain, and it would soon find its way down the chimney, slip-sliding down into the living room and covering every stitch of carpet like a cancer. It would crawl up off the floor and cover the furniture and the books and the light bulbs, removing the light from everything until the family had to move in darkness. The ichor would spread, turning the food in the pantry and the fridge into mold and decay before smothering the refrigerator light, each food item covered in smoothest black. Slow, undulating waves of the stuff would find the stairs and crawl upward, becoming one with the carpet of each step and wrapping around the railing all the way up. Upstairs, the black would slide beneath bedroom doors and into bathroom drains, making its presence known throughout every facet of the home before coating the boy's room. It would cover every surface surrounding his bed before circling around him. It would reach up and out, undulating itself onto his bedspread. The weight of it would surprise him as it crept nearer to him. It would cover his bare skin, would be cold to the touch, and then it would part his mouth and force its way inside him, filling him from the inside out. He would be made of black. He would be the black. And with these thoughts he fell asleep easily and blissfully as the storms raged on outside. Daylight returned, and with it came thick, choking humidity. He sat at the table eating a bowl of cereal his mother made him. Now she was the one preventing him from returning to the field, stating it would be too muddy just yet and that he'd be better off playing closer to home anyway in case the weather turned. The boy shoveled another spoonful of cereal into his mouth and looked out the sliding glass doors leading to the patio and saw that the skies were an electric and completely cloudless blue all the way to the horizon in every direction. He chose not to argue, though he could have. Instead, he mumbled a half-hearted assent and finished eating his breakfast in silence. Any other Saturday, and he would have been in front of the television watching cartoons, but today he went to his room, got dressed, and strolled out into the backyard while covering his eyes. He turned to look in the direction of the abandoned building, but could barely see it above the neighborhood rooftops. From here, it just looked like an old broken-down thing that didn't belong in the skyline. It did, however, seem to have a kind of darkened halo surrounding it. He wondered if he was the only one to see it, or if all those people who had marked up the walls also saw it, or if he was simply making it all up in his head. He put on a jacket, pocketed some peanut snacks, and played pretend in the yard for a while, assuming the role of one of his video game heroes, a captain in a space army who had seemingly unlimited amount of weaponry at his disposal. Just like in the game, he found a place high up in his backyard tree and surveyed the surrounding area. He knew that holding the higher ground was somehow strategically advantageous, even though he wouldn't be able to put that feeling into words until much later in life. He stared out towards the abandoned building from his perch high up in the tree and ate his peanuts slowly and without hunger. No one could see him from the ground, what with the limbs being so full of leaves, so he made himself comfortable and leaned his head back against the trunk while his legs dangled on either side of the limb. He wondered what the creek looked like after so many days of rain. Had it overflowed? Would there be more frogs? An orange-chested, black-bodied bird flew up into the branches noisily and startled him, nearly making him lose his already precarious balance on the limb. The bird had perched not far from him and seemed to stare at him as if it had interrupted it rather than the other way around. He stared back at it, noticing that its left wing had become lame. It didn't seem to lay flat against its body the way the right one did. The bird didn't hobble, but it certainly didn't move smoothly the way he thought a bird was supposed to. He held out his hand, fully expecting the bird to fly off in distress at coming so close to a human. Instead, the bird hopped closer, but only in short, distrustful jumps. Each time he moved, the bird would cock its head the other way and stare at him until finally the bird leapt upon his hand and clutched his forefinger. He rummaged around in his jacket pocket for more peanuts and found the package nearly empty. He crushed the remaining nuts still inside with his free hand and then brought the package out slowly so as to not disturb his new bird friend. He could feel the tiny crushed pieces slowly spilling out into the area between him and the bird, who looked at the pieces, cocked his head downward, and then began pecking away at the tasty bits on the tree limb. He looked down and smiled at his new friend pecking away happily. A gentle breeze filtered through the leaves and displaced a lock of hair across his forehead. The limbs moved slightly, and more sunlight fell through the foliage above. He looked up and squinted into the light, and became blinded for the briefest of moments. He shook his head to rid himself of the blindness and felt his grip on the limb slipping. Soon he was falling and clutching at things that weren't there. He fell, looking up, and watched in slow motion as the tree seemed to move farther and farther away from him, until he felt the earth against his back and his breath knocked out of him. He groaned and tried to breathe, failing at both as he laid there in the shade of the tree. He stared off to the left as he slowly regained his breath and began to cough. The black aura around the abandoned building off on the horizon had returned. He felt movement in his right hand and realized that he had tightened his grip around the bird during the fall. It pecked at his hand, but he kept his fingers wrapped tight around its body despite the pain and the blood starting to show. More, he heard inside his head, the phrase more a slither than a voice. Once he'd regained his breath fully and could sit up, he began the long trek to the abandoned building with the bird in his hand, pecking away feverishly at a finger that was quickly losing skin and bleeding profusely. The black beckoned. Time passed. He didn't know how he got back to his bed, but there he was, under the sheets and still wearing his clothes from the day. They were muddy from his jaunt through the field to the building. At least that's what he assumed. He couldn't remember much after he'd fallen from the tree. He couldn't remember much after the day had stolen his breath. He sat up and felt something catch in his throat. He tried to hack it up, but began coughing instead. A tiny black feather flew out of his mouth and onto his lap. He sat there, stunned, in the dark, and then blew on the feather. It went up and then spiraled down off over the edge of the bed, and then it was just him in the quiet house in the nighttime. When the snow came months later, it fell hard and turned the whole world white for weeks. If he played out in the backyard during the day, he couldn't see the abandoned building way out beyond. The shorter light of the days meant a longer dark, and the boy could sense more than see the building's darkness better during the nights. Its black aura had strengthened and grown, as if the cold had bolstered it and kept it well nourished. He thought it felt like calligraphy in the sky, especially on those nights when the horizon was a vibrant, deep crimson smashed between the black above and the white below. He felt most comfortable in his skin those nights, standing out in the backyard when he was allowed, though this was a feeling he wouldn't be able to put into words until much later in life. The winter was long and cold and wet. It also provided the random school day cancellation during the week if streets got too icy, though his mother would always have to go to work no matter what. On these days, he was to stay inside where it was warm, read on the couch, and try to keep the TV to a minimum. And of course, he did none of these things. While he never went all the way to the building, he certainly made most of the trip through the fields, even though he couldn't fully remember making the trek down there. The fields would be muddy and wet, and his pants would be caked in mud. The cold would seep through to his skin and shock him back to the moment with its icy touch. He would remember leaving his yard, but he would not remember much else. Hours would pass before he would return to the moment and realize what had happened. He would turn to head back home where the evidence of his unintended misbehavior would get tracked across the carpeted hallways. He'd barely make it home before his mother would slide into the driveway and get the car stuck halfway up every time. He spent many days of the cold winter grounded in his room, left to his own devices and often looking off to the east where the darkness seemed to coagulate there in the sky. It didn't seem like anyone else could see it or hear it. If they could, they ignored it and never spoke of it to him or in public. He didn't understand the silence of others surrounding the darkness, didn't understand why little bits of memory kept getting snatched away from him or why pockets of nothing were put in their place. A mild thaw came just before school opened back up after the holidays. He'd spent Christmas cooped up and playing with toys he hadn't asked for while his mother had, again, gone to work. She left when it was dark and returned when it was the same. He wondered if she ever got to see the daylight or if she was so busy that all she saw was the darkness too. Neighbor kids had stopped by one weekend and asked if he could come out to play. From the doorway of his bedroom he could hear her explain that he'd been grounded and wouldn't be able to play for a while, and she was sorry about that. The disappointment in their voices carried through the home until she shut the door and then all was quiet again. From an upstairs window he watched them walk away, dragging their sleds behind them through the melting snow until they were nothing but tiny specks of black far off in the dirty white field beyond. He wondered how long they would stay out there. He wondered how close they would get to the abandoned building. He wondered if any of them saw the same darkness that he did. He wondered if any of them had ever chanced to explore its deeper recesses. He wondered if any of them heard the same voices. The snow fell hard again at the end of February. His mother had fallen asleep, exhausted from a double shift at work, on the couch with the television on hours ago, and he remained awake, unable to sleep. He drank warm milk and counted sheep the way the cartoons did when they tried to sleep, and nothing worked. Eventually he returned to his room and sat inside his dark closet, a thing he did every so often to calm himself. No light could get in, and the sound became muffled because of the clothing hanging above. He sat below the t-shirts and pants hung up with care by his mother after she did laundry. He could smell the fabric softener on the air, nearly choking him with its fragrance in the dark closet. He ran his hands along the carpet in regular patterns, calming himself with the movement. Several minutes passed, and then the pattern changed. His hand bumped into something long and cold and sharp. A nail. Where had this come from? He picked it up and examined it by touch in the dark, letting his hands explore every inch. As soon as he wrapped his fingers around the entirety of it, the voice returned and seemed to slither into his mind with ease. "Carve your heart," it hissed. His fingers clutched the nail tighter, its pointed end breaking skin and sending warm rivulets of blood down his palms and onto the carpet. At first he thought he'd imagined the voice, but soon it urged him again to carve his heart, and without knowing how or why, he began using the nail to scratch bloody words into the wall hidden behind his hanging clothing. the inevitable. I am all that you are. I am the hunger of the deepest recesses of the world. I am dying light in lifeless eyes. I am that which comes from many names. I am that which has no name. I am the glisten on a darkened heart. I am the flesh caught between the gnashing of teeth. I am the silver tongue and the smell of spilled blood. I am the buried flesh. I am the shriveled organs. I am the hair turned white. I am the age of years. I am the chasm and the black. I am no exit. I am the one true way. I am all and I am nothing. I am every shadow. I am the space. I am the quiet whisper in the night. I am the sin. I am apocryphal. I am irrevocable. I am that which bubbles underneath the skin. I am misfired synapse. I am every buried thought. I am every buried soul. I am a cemetery of dreams. I am a contagious nightmare. I am the discarded skin at twilight's passing. I am the nerve center of a god that does not exist. I am the dead language. And with that, his hand stopped moving. He hadn't realized what he was doing until the nail fell out of his hand onto the floor. The surrounding carpet beneath the wall was speckled with red stains, and some blood still ran down the wall from the etchings he'd created. He reread the text and couldn't understand what it meant, much less remember that he'd done it. He retrieved an old sock from his dresser and wrapped his hand so that he wouldn't make more of a mess than he already had. After scrubbing himself clean and putting a bandage over the wound, he returned to the closet and began rearranging the clothing so that it hid the wall more. After, he moved some of his larger toys to the bottom of the closet to hide the stained carpet below. Satisfied with his handiwork, he soon fell asleep still wearing his clothes from the day, determined to do his own laundry from that day forward. Spring arrived soon after, and with it the snow thawed quickly. Warmer weather lent itself to the boy getting to play outside again, but only if he promised to wipe off his shoes and remove his pants before entering the house if mud was involved. And so he played outside. He drank in the sunshine of the lengthening days and the shortening nights, and he reconnected with the neighborhood kids he'd not gotten to play with much during the unusually snowy winter months. He'd seen them in school, of course, but it wasn't the same as they were all in different classes and grades. As the school year began coming to a close, the hair on the back of his neck began standing up more and more. The darkness didn't seem to be speaking to him as much, but he could feel it there in the back of his brain, lying in wait, patient and hungry. If he focused too much on it, it felt like staring at a fuzzy black wall. If he left it alone and allowed it to marinate in the background, he could focus on his homework and recess and spelling tests. So he left it alone, and a shaky symbiosis remained. This held steady for several long weeks until his third period science teacher made an announcement. They would soon be able to sign up and choose which of the class pets to take home and care for over a weekend, a thing she had finally convinced the principal to allow. The darkness seemed to come forward like a tsunami. He could feel it take over, coming more into focus and smothering each of his thoughts the longer his teacher explained. Though she kept talking, it was as if the volume of her voice was being turned down inside his head as the black took control. Behind his eyes he could trace its lines and see indescribable features in its movements, and understood in that moment that he was simply a vessel, a thing through which the darkness moved and acted. And though he understood this at his core, he would never be able to put that feeling into words. A bell rang off in the distance, somewhere that felt both miles away and right next to his ear. He seemed to feel someone in his periphery, and though he tried to focus on them, something kept him from doing so. He felt a hand on his shoulder, shaking him. The teacher had pulled him out and away from the dark, had told him he needed to go to his next class. When he looked around, he saw the other kids from the class had already disappeared, and only he remained. He nodded slowly to his teacher and saw the paper laying on top of his desk. The darkness had scribbled a single word on it while having control. Rabbit. He snatched the paper off the desk, crumpled it up, and shoved it into his pocket as he ran out of the room to his next class. 3 weeks later, he was carrying the rabbit home for the weekend. He had become its de facto caretaker. He sat the cage on top of the dinner table, a place he knew his mother wouldn't allow the rabbit to stay. But while he cleaned the cage, the thing would shit again, which led to more cleaning and more time for the rabbit to be uncaged, and this was the best place for it. He didn't much care for most of this caretaking of an animal, and neither did his mother, to be honest, but if it was for school, then it had to be done, so she'd agreed reluctantly as long as she wasn't expected to help him out. He assured her that she wouldn't have to do anything. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the sliding glass doors leading to the back patio. The weather had warmed and made the weekends perfect for riding bikes and neighborhood games that lasted until sundown, but here he was on a Saturday, corralling a rabbit on his kitchen table and cleaning up after its messes. The thing couldn't seem to stop peeing everywhere either. Though he'd cleaned the table thoroughly, he would never tell his mother what had happened while she was off running her weekend errands. The rabbit came with a harness and a leash in case he'd wanted to take it out for a walk. He turned the idea around in his head for a while, wondering if it might not do the animal some good to get outside for a bit, to be back in its natural state. He picked it up with both hands, readying to put the harness on, and found himself marveling at the softness of its fur. He cradled the rabbit in the crook of his arm like an infant and stroked its ears and its head and then all the way down its back. He could feel the life of it thrumming beneath the surface, the twitching of muscles, the hot blood flowing beneath that, the rapid beating of its heart even deeper beneath that. The rabbit's black eyes fixated on him and seemed to stay locked. The rabbit didn't seem to want to look anywhere. The boy could feel the fuzzed-out darkness growing behind his eyes, could feel it slowly pushing forward and taking over. Rather than fight against it, he allowed it to do what it wanted. He was now a passenger along for the ride, a spectator while also the conductor. He tried to make the motions of petting the rabbit again, but found he was unable. He could no longer make his hands do what he wanted, though he could still feel them holding onto the animal firmly. He watched as his body carried the rabbit to his bedroom. He watched as his free hand lifted his school bag and unzipped it. He watched himself turn the backpack upside down and empty it of its notebooks and pens and papers and leftover candies all over his bed. He watched himself place the rabbit in the largest part of the bag, its legs scampering and scrambling around against his arms as he lowered it down. He watched himself zip up the bag, put it on his back, and walk down the hallway. The boy didn't remember leaving the house. He didn't remember feeling the sun on his face the moment he stepped outside. He didn't remember waving to the older woman who lived next door as he walked toward the field. He didn't remember walking through the field, the wild burrs and stickers clinging to his socks and shoelaces. He didn't remember leaping easily across the dried-up creek that had seen so much rain that spring. He didn't remember walking into the abandoned building, but he did remember coming forward and taking back over the moment he stepped onto the cement floor of the building, its dusty surface tracking his footprints as he moved, with purpose, toward the stairwell that led deep down into its blackest recesses. At the bottom, he closed his eyes, for what could he see down there anyway, and placed his backpack on the ground. He unzipped it slowly, not wanting the animal to escape. The air around him became humid and hot, moistening the dark as if the room was sweating. Could he feel something breathing against the back of his neck? Or was that simply a lone, hot breeze coming from somewhere upstairs? More, the voice inside his head whispered. He pulled the rabbit out by the scruff of its neck, its legs scrambling faster and faster at the air, trying to run away from both him and the dark. He could feel its heartbeat thumping wildly against its insides as if trying to escape too. A gust of wind came from the depths of the room, swirling and eddying around him before rushing up the stairs behind him. When he opened his eyes, he found himself standing near the dried-up creek bed, his backpack strapped across his shoulders and the sunlight bearing down on him as if it were just another day. He felt it bubbling up inside him and began coughing. He doubled over, hoping to expunge whatever it was inside him, but continued to cough and cough, nearly choking. Eventually, he was able to remove a tuft of gray fur from his mouth, having nearly vomited as he pulled it out. He tossed the tuft to the side without another thought and headed home. The fuzzed-out darkness inside him seemed still, seemed quiet. He realized he was going to have to make up a story about how the rabbit escaped. The boy knew he would be grounded again, but couldn't even guess for how long. He continued to hack up balls of fur as he walked home through the field. He counted 5 during the half-hour walk. The first week of summer was scorching hot. The community pool wouldn't be open for another 2 weeks, and none of the other kids had a pool in their backyard. Someone might set up a sprinkler to play in, but he kept getting off the couch to look out the window and saw nothing all day long, not even anyone out riding bikes. He could hear the constant buzz of cicadas through the walls. They were loud this year, or maybe they were loud every year, and he was only noticing because he felt he had nothing to do and no one to play with. He believed he could smell the sunlight filtering through the windows and the curtains and slipping through the cracks of the door hinges and the tiny hatchings in the window screens. He believed he could smell the very nature of summer filling up the house as he sat and stewed, hoping for the bright blue flare of pool water to be a part of his immediate future. He knew that was too much to ask, but the desire sat at the front of his imagination. Immediately he could imagine the hot cement against the bottom of his wet feet and the smell of sunblock floating in the air. The boy looked down at his hands and imagined his palms and fingers gone wrinkled and prune-like, the skin whitened from oversaturation. He could hear the whistles of the lifeguards who always seemed to be complaining about one thing or another about everyone in the pool. When he looked up, the idea dissipated and left him staring at the beige carpet of the living room. The television volume was all the way down, but it played some rerun of a show his mother might have watched. He was pretty sure he'd seen it before. Last summer, maybe. Certainly not this one yet. He got up to stare out the window again, hoping to catch someone, anyone, out in the street riding a bike or looking to start a pickup game of literally anything. The boredom of a summer day was the worst when he felt he had no options, even though he always had options, even if they weren't really what he wanted. If there were no other neighborhood kids out there, maybe they'd already gone on vacation. Maybe they were also stuck in their living rooms watching TV shows on mute and hoping someone would make their desire for play known by marching down the street in full view. He went to his room and rummaged around in the closet, careful not to reveal the bloodied message in the wall. Not only did he not want his mother to see it, but he didn't want to see it either. After that first night, he'd sat in front of it and read it over and over a few times, trying to understand what he'd written. He couldn't comprehend most of it, and if he were being truthful, some of it started to seem like gibberish after a while. Some words became unreadable, or their letters seemed to change into made-up words that made no sense. At that point, he thought it would be better to just cover it up and leave well enough alone. Staring at it wasn't doing him any good. But his mother had been impressed with his desire to learn how to do his own laundry. She didn't question it so much as became relieved by it, if with a dash of anxiety for his first few loads while she was out of the house. But he'd picked up on the concept pretty quickly and never seemed to have any issues, so by the time the summer came around, she went to work knowing that his laundry was just one less thing she had to worry about. He dug around through the toys at the bottom of the closet and found a ball and glove he'd not played with in a while. He tried to play a season of baseball, but he missed so many practices due to his mother's work schedule that he eventually just lost all interest in playing an organized game entirely. At the very least, he could practice some pitching at one of the walls of the old abandoned building if no one else came out to play. He still liked the motions of the game, but he had no interest in playing in an organized version of the sport. When he left the house, he made sure he had his keys and locked the door behind him. Down the street, a huge yellow truck took up the entire driveway of a house no one had lived in since the winter. Men in uniforms removed boxes from the back and carried them into the house. A tall man with glasses stood outside watching them while a woman held onto a dog on a leash while he explored the yard. But there it was. Someone was moving in. He hoped they had at least one kid, one who was cool and fun and who would play with them. Unlikely, but you never knew. It wasn't like the neighborhood had a lot of people coming and going, so anything was possible. He remembered overhearing his mom on the phone one night talking about how the previous family had simply up and moved without much notice after something had happened to one of the children. At that point, his mother began whispering into the phone he could no longer follow the conversation. When he turned to look at her from the couch, she had a strange look on her face that he couldn't explain. But then she turned away from him quickly and stepped around the corner into the kitchen. Sweat beaded up on the back of his neck and down his back. He'd made it halfway down to the field when he realized he should have brought some kind of water bottle. He stopped and turned around to look back toward his house. Should he go back? Was it even worth it? He decided it wasn't and kept on, sweat building up in the cracks and crevices of his arms and behind his knees. He realized that he couldn't feel the darkness, that he hadn't felt it all morning, and that was strange. Even if it wasn't in full control, he could normally feel it hovering in the back of his mind, like it was waiting or sleeping. He felt none of that today. It had not reached out and made its presence known, and that was a curious thing that he couldn't explain. He made a small jump across the mostly dried up creek and realized he could hear a voice around on the other side of the building. It was a high voice, so he couldn't tell if it was a girl or another boy, but he walked around the corner, curious, and came face to face with a girl wearing denim overalls and a white t-shirt beneath. He couldn't be sure, but she seemed to be a little older than him, though he couldn't tell by how many years. She had been singing a made-up song to herself and held a bouquet of plucked dandelions and white and purple wildflowers. She turned, unstartled and unafraid, when she heard him come up behind her. The sun lit up her face and reflected off the dark brown curls of her hair. She raised her free hand to cover her eyes from the sun and said nothing. Even her face remained stony and unreadable. No smile spread across it. Hi, he stammered, nearly losing his grip on the ball and glove. Hey, she replied. He realized he'd never seen her before, that she was a complete stranger. Well, where do you go to school? He asked. Are you new? She shrugged and motioned to the sky around her. I don't go to school during the summer, do you? No, I guess I don't, he replied sheepishly. She nodded toward the abandoned building. What's the story with that place? It's got a weird vibe to it. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it belongs here, does it? She shook her head. You ever been inside? I mean, have you ever explored it? I bet it's super creepy. He nodded and shrugged. It's not as creepy as you might think, but yeah, I've been inside it a few times. It gets pretty dark, even during the daytime, but that's mostly down in the basement. The day buzzed around them. He could feel the heat of the sun against his back, making him sweat through the fabric of his shirt even more. He realized he could no longer see the fuzzed-out blackness outlining the building. It was just a building with broken windows along its uppermost floors and covered in a sad gray facade that seemed out of place not far from the neighborhood. He looked back at the girl. She seemed to be excited about exploring the building. If I go inside, will you go with me? She asked. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid, but it's just too interesting not to check out. He hadn't really planned on going inside the building today, but she was new and pretty cute, and he had to admit that going inside with a new friend seemed like a pretty good way to spend the day. At least there would be shade. Sure, he replied, smiling. Soon they were at the gaping maw of the entrance. So where are you from? He asked as they stepped inside. The lack of breeze meant the heat of the day broiled the musty building's insides. He could feel the hair on his arms and neck stand at attention. The skin on his arm goose-pimpled the way it had the first time he'd set foot in here. Nowhere and everywhere, she replied as they stepped inside out of the sunlight. Had he been thinking clearer, he might have recognized the voice. The girl stepped out of the park area and onto the street that led to her new house and walked along the asphalt. The noonday sun beat down upon her, reminding her of its power. By the time she could see her new home, the moving truck had disappeared from the driveway, and her parents were inside unpacking boxes in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do for lunch. Hey, kiddo, her father yelled from his place near the fridge. Find some fun spots to explore? She nodded and couldn't seem to remember how she'd gotten back home. She didn't remember the walk back from wherever she'd been. Much of the day was fuzzed out, blackened from her memory. Her mother emerged from the garage and saw her. What have you got there, honey? She asked. The girl looked down and realized she'd been carrying a baseball glove with a ball inside it. She shrugged at her mother. Just something I found in the park. No one was around. Thought I might see if there was a lost and found or something, but... Oh, honey, that's a great idea. Maybe we'll take them with us when we go make introductions to the neighbors, too. Okay, sure, she replied. I feel a little tired. May I go lie down for a bit? Her father moved close to her and put the back of his hand on her forehead. You feel a little hot, but nothing unusual. You were outside most of the day. Your bed's not put together yet, but if you want, you can go lay down on the settee in our bedroom. She gave him a weak smile and nodded before turning to leave. Okay, thanks. I'll bring some water up in a moment, hon, her mother yelled from the kitchen. The girl climbed the stairs slowly, each step seemingly heavier than the last, until she reached her parents' bedroom at the far end of the house. She curled up onto the settee with the glove and ball pulled close to her chest. Then came the coughing. So much coughing, she could barely breathe. Finally, she felt the irritant and got it up to go to the bathroom to see if she could pull it out by sight. More coughing erupted as she coughed up a ball of brownish hair, flecked with red, nearly retching as it flew out of her mouth and into the sink's basin. She stood and stared at the ball before she picked it up calmly with a tissue and then flushed it down the toilet. Feeling better, she laid back down on the settee and closed her eyes. The darkness came forward and seemed to populate the entirety of her mind, fuzzing out everything else that might have tried to come to the front of her thoughts. She was very nearly asleep when she heard it come from somewhere inside her, like a snarl or a hiss. The voice emerged from deep within, and she could do nothing to stop it from coming. But she didn't want to keep it from coming. She wanted to let it all in, and she wanted to feel it consume her, fill her up from top to bottom. And though she understood this at her core, she would never be able to put this particular feeling into words. "More," it said. "More." Thanks for tuning in. That was Lambs, coming out in my next collection, Under a Black Rainbow. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.